Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. At this point, we will be having a special panel for this year's forum entitled The Role of PPP in Build, Build, Build. To introduce this special panel, may we please call on stage the President of the European Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines, Mr. Nabil Francis.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good afternoon and bon appetit to everybody. My name is Nabil Francis. I'm the current president of the European Chamber. This chamber was established in 1964, and as a matter of fact, this is the oldest chamber, oldest European chamber established outside of Europe. We have more than 700 members, and among those members we are counting with the top European companies, but also many local companies, since it's a bilateral chamber, encouraging investment in the Philippines, but also investments from the Philippines to outside. We have 4 chapters. We have 4 chapters outside Manila, 2 in Mindanao, 1 in Davao and Cagayan de Oro, 1 in Cebu, and 1 in Clark, and of course the main one is here. In my day job, I work as the CEO of Republic Cement, and that's why I'm expecting a lot from this panel. Cement being one of the most utilized building material in the Build, Build, Build program, and just wanted to say that we were very proud to build the future of this country. So today's special panel on the role of PPP in the Build, Build, Build program does not have a policy brief. However, Arangkada has produced related policy brief for airports, broadbands, rail and road, seaports and water, and this year, power. The joint foreign chambers are very supportive of the Build, Build, Build program. It's at the same forum here during the Aquino administrations when we were informed that 5% of the GDP spent would be on infrastructure. And at the same forum, still in 2016, we were informed by the DBM secretary of an higher target going up to 7% of the GDP spent. So since the requirement for infrastructure modernizations are so enormous, we believe that GAA and ODA are not enough. Also, when GDP per capita in the Philippines will reach a higher level in the next year, the country will not be anymore eligible for concessional ODA loans under the OECD rules. So for those reasons, PPP becomes more important. And the recently new proposed list of projects for inclusion in the infrastructure, in the Build, Build, Build program, the so-called flagship project. Now this has grown from 75 to 200 projects, and part of those, 29 out of those 100 projects are designated as PPP. Most are unsolicited, in line with the current policy preference. Some are hybrid. So we hope to learn today if more solicited projects may be offered as well. As a backdrop to the panel conversation, we'll be showing visuals of major projects that are included in the NEDA list. It's an honor for me today to introduce our speaker, Under Secretary Ferdinand Boyet Pecson, Executive Director of the PPP Center of the Philippines, to speak about the role of PPP in the Build, Build, Build program. Yusek Boyet has a doctorate in engineering and an MBA in management, and an extensive experience working in the private sector. Following his remarks, Yusek Boyet will join the panel. Our moderator today is Michelle Ong, one of the dynamic women news anchors of ABS-CBN news channel. And then we'll have three experts on the PPP panel who have deep experience working on those projects in the Philippines. So they will join us on the panel, Attorney Alberto Agra, Mr. Gabriel Lim, and my dear colleague, Cosette Canilo. Please get set for an exciting and informative discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, good afternoon to everyone. It seems that I will be competing with your lunch, so I'll try my best to get your attention even while you, of course, should enjoy your lunch. The question that was posed to me when I was asked to speak in this event is the question, is there a role for PPPs in the build? Well, the answer, of course, is a resounding yes. But the more significant question, really, and I say this with due respect to the framer of the first question, is how can we strengthen further the role of the private sector in the build? Isn't that the question we should be asking? That the government needs the help of the private sector is a non-issue. Let me just cite a few statistics where we are really lacking. Schools. According to the Alliance of Concerned Teachers, we are lacking 30,000 school buildings in the whole country. What about access to safe water? There are 7 million Filipinos still without that access, according to water.org. And an even bigger number, 24 million Filipinos with no access to proper sanitation. What about electricity? This came out from Senator Gatchalian. 16% of households are not connected to the electricity grid. I can go on and on, but the point being made is that really, despite all the efforts that government is doing, we have these gaps. And how do we fill the gaps? Of course, it would be through the private sector. So what else, in answering the question, what else is missing? And I try to emphasize the word else because there's been a lot of talk about what the government needs to do. So I try to add value to the discussion by talking of things which perhaps government is not as candid as it should be, especially in public fora like this. First, government has to be clear on where it needs help. Okay, it's very good at listing projects, but it's not clear in saying, here we need the private sector really. Because that will make things more simple. Second, government has to be clear on what it wants. It cannot just say, I need or we need a new airport, because there are so many things. There's 100 or so different things that you have to specify when you are talking of airports. We should not be having the private sector guess on what we want, because if we're not clear, then it is going to be a long back and forth or a long a tedious process, a back and forth process until things get pinned down. Third, instead of simply avoiding risks, we should do a better job, or we should perhaps, I should perhaps even say, we should learn how to manage risks. Now, let me explain that a bit. Risk is inevitable in any project, even non-PPP projects. Perhaps more so with PPPs because it's a long-term project. No? If it's a 2-year project, then the number of risks to be managed won't be as much as if you have, let's say, a 30-year agreement. But what unfortunately is happening is that after signing the contract, we don't pay much attention to managing the risks. If you ask for risk management plans, you'll probably get a lot of scratching of the head. But managing risk is the way to take on risks. If you don't know how to manage risks, how can you take on risks? And by simply avoiding risk, then we cannot move forward with a lot of partnerships. Next, government has to take regulation more seriously. There's a lot of conflict of interest going on. Yesterday, I was talking to John Forbes, and I said, what about the idea of a central regulatory commission, independent, okay, not subject to politics, and that is really capacitated to take on regulation of fees, regulation of safety, whatever else that needs to be regulated, really seriously. And not just, again, just avoid the issue of whenever there are petitions for tariff increases, the most convenient thing to do is to just not do anything. But that cannot be. That will not create the conducive environment for more private sector participation. Government also has to create a stronger environment for competition to happen. And I say this especially that we are having more and more of unsolicited proposals. Now, of course, I'd like to be clear that I'm not against unsolicited proposals, but what I am for is that even in the case of unsolicited proposals, we give a chance to other participants so that we get the best value for money. Because that's what really value for money is all about, being able to choose from among offers. And perhaps I don't need to elaborate on that further unless I'm pressed to later on during the panel discussion, but really there's a room for improvement insofar as competition is concerned. The PPP Center is working on getting reforms to the BOT law via the PPP Act that will soon be legislated. Now, I'm sure that as many of you are from the private sector, and as I can see, quite a number of you have actually been part of the PPP program, that you have also your own ideas on how we can create a more conducive environment for private sector participation. So this is the debate that I'd like us to focus on. It's not about whether it should be 100 projects in the flagship, or there should be more than 100, or whether we are delayed, or whether those projects were actually started by the previous administration. Let's forget all of that. Let's focus on the work that needs to be done. And we can only do that. I'm from government. We can really only get the work done if you from the private sector will really more strongly participate. So I look forward to our panel discussion to hear feedback from you and also to hear your ideas because we are not, we don't have the monopoly of good ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our guest speaker, Dr. Pekson. Kindly stay on stage for the panel discussion. May we now call on stage our moderator for this panel. She is a news anchor of ABS-CBN News Channel, Miss Michelle Ong. Joining her are the following: certified PPP specialist and professor of laws, Attorney Alberto Agra. Next is the COO of Aboitiz Infra Capital Incorporated, Ms. Cosette Canilao. And to complete the panel, may we call on stage the SVP of BDO Capital and Investment Corporation, Mr. Gabriel Lim.
Okay, how's everybody feeling? Still up? Still awake? Hi, are you still there? Okay, so this is an exciting panel discussion because it's all about infrastructure. So the world is full of fascinating and sometimes unfathomably huge infrastructure projects. Around the world, you've got the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, which is supposed to connect 43 million people from 3 different cities. You've got Norway's ambition to build the first fully submerged floating tunnel. Or you've got Iraq's skyscraper called the Bride, which is an iconic veil of solar power. So my first question to our panelists this afternoon: what do you think, in your opinion, so far, is the pinnacle of the Philippine infrastructure story? You can name an infrastructure project from whatever generation, from whatever administration, finished or not finished. So if you could name just one infrastructure, the best to represent the Philippine story, what would it be?
Okay, let me try to answer that question. By not answering the question. We have so many friends here, and of course, they will accuse me of favoritism if I name one project. It's Aboitiz, for example, and then the Pangilinan group will say, why didn't you mention our project? But anyway, I think I can speak for Filipinos here when it comes to infrastructure. Just get it done. I mean, we're not, Filipinos are, I would say, much simpler. They just want to really infrastructure that would solve congestion, infrastructure that would improve health services delivery, infrastructure that will improve livelihood of people. I mean, again, I can go on and on. So it's really a gamut of different types of infrastructure that we need to build, and we're talking of infrastructure not just at the national level, but also at the local level. And that's why I mentioned school buildings earlier. I mentioned hospitals, or did I mention hospitals? I should have mentioned hospitals, water. So we are talking of very, very basic needs, in fact.
But taking out your PPP director hat, if you had a foreigner friend and he asks you, Yusek Pekson, what infrastructure should Philippines be known for? What would it be? I'm very curious, on a personal level.
Yeah. Let me give a chance then to
Okay.
my colleagues.
Okay, Attorney
Yes.
Agra.
when you asked that question, what came to mind was not reclamation. Um, by the way, I'm the chairman of the Philippine Reclamation Authority. What came to mind was actually transport-related projects.
Which one?
Naming three, the Makati Subway Project, the third bridge in Cebu, connecting Cebu City and Cordova, and the provincial joint venture agreement ferrying people from Mall of Asia to Bataan. Why are these of note insofar as I'm concerned? One, because these are local government projects undertaken together with the private sector. So for me, those are of note. No?
Ma'am Cosette, of course you can't name Aboitiz infra projects. Or okay, you can.
What was the question again?
What do you think is the pinnacle of the Philippine infrastructure story? One infrastructure project. Name one.
Siyempre daw, dapat avoid this project. All our unsolicited proposals. No, kidding aside, I think the Philippines, there's a huge gap of, there's a huge infrastructure requirements that the private sector as well as the government need to deliver. And any single infrastructure project that's finished, whether it's an airport or a road or mass transit, would alleviate the congestion that we're seeing air, land, and even in the seas. So any project, but the one closest to my heart probably is because I travel a lot. And when the NAIA Expressway wasn't there yet, it used to take me more than 2 hours to get there. Now, whenever I'd make a mistake of going to Terminal 1 instead of Terminal 2, I don't get so anxious anymore because of the expressway.
Mr. Lim?
Yeah, I think the Philippines has such a huge infrastructure deficit. Previously, we were going through boom and bust cycles for the economy. In the meantime, the population and its needs continue to grow, notwithstanding the lack of infrastructure, which is why today we see the horrific traffic along EDSA. People complain about it every day, and it's not being alleviated. But there's no particular PPP project that comes to mind immediately. But I would like to point out that because of the huge energy generation deficit that we were faced with in the 1990s, when we had 12-hour brownouts, 16-hour brownouts, people had to walk up 10 floors just to get to their offices, walk back down just to get home. I think the most successful sector that has been able to implement the PPP model is on a massive scale, in billions of pesos, is the power sector. There may be a lot of criticism regarding the types of contracts that were entered into, especially in the initial stages. But, Monday morning quarterbacks have perfect vision. What was the alternative to those projects then? Nothing. Energy is the driver of economic development. Even if you build thousands of kilometers of roads, if you do not have electricity, nothing happens. The more recent project that comes to mind as a model of a successful PPP during the more recent times, I would say would be the Mactan Cebu International Airport. When the private sector took over, before it dug the first hole to expand the project, immediately you could see the change in the way the infrastructure was deployed, how the proponents were able to make the operations more efficient. That's what the private sector is able to bring to the table for these PPP projects. Which is why today, you see a lot of local conglomerates like Aboitiz looking at airport projects because they see a model that has worked well and they would like to be able to participate in that opportunity.
Okay, we'll talk about the soup alphabet for infra models later. But first, Yusek Pekson, from 75 to 100, the flagship projects list has been expanded to include 29 public-private partnership projects. 29. Out of 29, 8 are already ongoing. Question number 1, realistically, how many do you think can be completed by President Duterte's term? How many would be started by the time he steps down? And more importantly, is this some sort of admission from the government that they initially failed to recognize the importance of the private sector?
Okay, so I thought we could avoid the question, but here we are. Well, first of all, the 29, or maybe tomorrow it's 30, or maybe 35.
Do you know
But-
something we don't? Who's
It's,
submitting tomorrow?
It's a moving, well, they have, or our economic managers, and Mr. Vince Dison has articulated this. It's not that list is not etched in stone. Is as we go along, as we look at both opportunities and risk, and also obstacles, then we'll have to adjust. So this is like, you know, a basketball game where you cannot play the same strategy all throughout the 4 quarters if things are shifting, right? And things have shifted. Okay. Now the PPP projects that are in that list are nothing new really, except for a few. Very, very few. But for the most part, these are projects and a lot of them really are there waiting for approval, what the so-called ICC, Investment Coordination Committee Cabinet Cluster process. It's a committee of the NEDA. So they have been waiting for approval. So it's not a new list, except again for a few. So what is new, for example, is a bulk water project involving the Wawa Dam, which to be honest, I saw for the first time. This has not been brought to the attention of the PPP Center yet. Now your question about when will this be finished?
How many? Of the 29 now,
Yes.
how many do you think can be completed,
Yes,
realistically?
you know, that is the most dangerous question to answer because I'll be held accountable for whatever number I will say. But really, it's, you know, if you know me, you would see a Boyet, or you see me as somebody who is not political. I only focus on getting things done. So we will do our best. That's what I could say to get as many of these projects done. There are big challenges ahead, whether it's right of way again, or whether it's really just, first of all, getting government to be clear on what it wants, because we had projects waiting for approval and it had to be restructured along the way. So I cannot really put a number on how many of those will be completed, but I can only say that I know how hard now my colleagues in government are really working, and they really want to deliver.
Okay, Attorney Agra, I wanted to ask you, because you're the PPP, you're Mr. PPP, you wrote the PPP code. So if you could very briefly define PPP, it's a soup alphabet, PPP versus BOT versus JV, or joint venture. Very quickly.
No. Actually, let's not put the word versus, because PPP is the overarching strategy, while the BOT law, joint ventures, and even long-term leases are what we call the arrangements or modalities under PPP. So all of these are arrangements under PPP. The way I define PPP, I'm a liberal, I espouse the liberal view towards PPP. And for me, any relationship between government on one hand and the private sector on the other is a PPP. And when I say government, including the barangays. Just to acknowledge, all the barangays in the province of Bataan have their own PPP frameworks. So I'm a firm believer in local government PPP as well as PPPs for government corporations and government instrumentalities. Just my take on the list. For me, I agree with the Undersecretary that this is not a new list. And my point here is the list is also not exclusive. We have a lot of projects out there. Unfortunately, there's no central database of all of this, including even barangay level projects, municipal, provincial projects. So I think that's the challenge. We need more, everybody needs more information. So the 29, the 26, or the 30, for me, is more projects with the national government and certain GOCCs, but by no means this is a complete list that will cover even barangays, municipalities, province, and other government corporations. Yeah.
Attorney Agra, would you say that a hybrid model, a hybrid arrangement is the best? Because this is what Finance Secretary Sonny Dominguez said. I remember 2 years ago, I was covering him. He said, we're not doing away with PPPs. We're okay with PPPs. We just want a combination. You know, the hard infrastructure will be built by, funded by Treasury or ODAs. Then the operations and maintenance can be taken over by the private sector. Hybrid. He cited Clark International Airport, for example.
Again, for me, these are all part of the menu. There are a lot of options. Pure PPP from end to end, hybrid. So there are a lot of PPPs can also bring about further PPPs. The key decision is making the appropriate choice for a particular project.
What's your favorite so far?
My favorite? Any PPP is a favorite of mine.
What is your best PPP scenario? Like an actual project that went through PPP that you'd say, wow, this is a model case.
Again, what comes to mind are local government projects on transport. Okay. I always say when I lecture, if I had the money, and I don't have the money, I will invest in transport-related PPP projects. Also, waste to energy.
Okay. Yusek wanted to say something.
I'd just like to add something to the hybrid project. It's really something that is not new. And given the fact that for some projects especially, if the project is really huge, if the capex is so great, even the private sector, I'm sure, will bulk at putting in a lot of money into the project. So we define what is the scope of the private sector, we define what is the scope to be done by government, and then we talk about financing, whether those to be done by government would be through ODA or through government appropriations. And then, of course, the one to be done by the private sector will be done through their private financing. So the question really is, how do we make it work? How do we ensure that we have successful hybrids? So it's not anymore the question, should we do it or not? Times are changing, demands of the modern world with a lot more financing options available should be taken advantage of. So that's why hybrids will become more and more prominent. But the key really is to tie this in together, because having a lot more parties involved is more complex. There are interfaces that have to be managed, and you have to plan these hybrids right from the beginning and not to think about the private sector as an afterthought.
Okay. Ma'am Cosette, from being the head of PPP before, you've shifted to the private sector, now head of Aboitiz Infra Capital. Question, with what you know now, what would you have done differently as head of PPP? Knowing what you know now, would you have done things differently as PPP head?
No, actually, as a matter of fact, when I left the PPP Center, there was a report forwarded to the Office of the President, which I think the PPP Center still has, that analyzes and breaks down the policy the policy reforms, the processes, improvements, as well as the project developments, and even challenges in the bidding and bringing the projects into execution. So I think during that time when the PPP program was jump-started, we needed to do all those to let everyone be on the same page. So I think during those 6 years since we started doing the PPPs, a lot of people became more aware and more appreciative of the PPP program. I think almost everyone, even the press-bee that followed us back then, became conversant about PPP. So you know what questions to ask, and then everyone became so aware of the provisions in the contract, and it gets to where we are right now. I suppose we lack time then to strengthen the institutions into doing execution of the projects, such that right-of-way provision would have been provided in a timely manner. And I suppose, well, this is what the PPP Center can probably work with, the multilateral agencies, not only focusing on the project preparation or project development, but more on strengthening institutional capacity in execution, like right-of-way provision.
Mr. Lim, I'm very curious, what is the biggest infrastructure loan that you've given out in the last 3.5 years? Because everyone's talking about how the loan growth is slowing down because the big companies who used to borrow big money for the big ticket PPPs, they didn't have the PPPs that they needed money for. So would you recall what your biggest infra loan is during the Duterte administration, the first half?
Well, BDO Capital, as the investment banking arm of BDO Unibank, typically arranges these types of loans with a consortium of banks who participate in a single loan facility for projects of this sort. In the last 3 years, I think the biggest one we arranged was for, if I'm not mistaken, GN Power Dinginin, which and for the San Buenaventura power project, which was just commissioned, I think, a month or so ago. Because of the current administration's initial thrust to tap ODA, multilateral loans, and resort to variants of PPP, where only the O&M contract is let out to the private sector, the capital requirements generally for PPP projects have gone down.
By how much?
Significantly, I would say, because PPP projects, being largely infrastructure projects, are very capital intensive before they can even brought into commercial operations. So they need a lot of capital to be sunk in over a period of sometimes 3 to 5 years. Especially 5 years, especially for the more difficult ones. Water, for example, bulk water supply. So because government was now funding these capital expenditures, the private sector no longer needed funds. But recently, let's say for instance, for the NAIA expansion and modernization project, composed of about 7 of the largest conglomerates in the Philippines. The capital requirements there, although the project seems large, the immediate capital requirements are not that big, relatively, because it's not a project that's going to be executed from scratch. We call that a brownfield project. So it's already operating, so the capital expenditures will have to be invested over time.
With PPP now back on the saddle in a big way, because USEC Pexon is very determined to really push this, do you expect loans to pick up?
Yes.
Significantly as well?
Well, relative to where we are today, yes. We expect loans for infrastructure projects to significantly pick up in various sectors, ports, airports.
Of course, Mr. Lim, you mentioned the NAIA rehabilitation. That is a group of 7 conglomerates, the biggest in the country, and the Aboitiz Infracapital is part of that. I wanted to ask Cosette, I know that there were delays because government wanted you to use the Clark template. And the Clark template was supposed to have the so-called MAGA, Material Adverse Government Action. If I understand it correctly, this MAGA was supposed to assign more risks to the private sector. Could you very briefly explain how that works? Because the insiders that we talked to, they were saying, we just didn't have a choice, but really this template leaves us at a less advantage.
Yeah, there were the preference of the government on risk allocation has changed, and that's reflected in the current concession agreements, especially the one that was signed between Clark and the private partner. Now, it will be reflected if the banks are willing to lend on such on a limited MAGA. Then there will be a project. We will be constrained by what the banks will be able to lend based on that. Now, having said that, though, some risks can be absorbed by the private sector depending on the project. Again, for airport projects, there are commercial components of that which can make the project more financially viable. But for example, for mass transit projects, the one that we really need here in the metro, which would involve, which are capital intensive and more capital expenditures would be required, then would the same MAGA be acceptable as well? We don't know. We'll ask the bankers.
Cosette, if you could flesh it out, what did government want?
I think
Yusek can actually explain. What was the Clark template?
So
what did government want?
Let's
What
have
was
the
risk
government
allocation?
to speak. Okay, MAGA, for the benefit of everyone here, is Material Adverse Government Action. So let's use some examples. Let's say in the contract, there is an agreement on a tariff adjustment. Okay? So a material adverse government action would be, let's say, government not implementing what is agreed in terms of tariff adjustment. So that would be MAGA. So
Government
of
needs
course,
to pay.
And why do we care about that? Because if it's recognized as MAGA and it reaches a certain materiality, so the first letter there is M, material. So, and just for the sake of discussion, let's say it's 300 million pesos. So that means if the loss to the private sector will amount to that amount, then the penalty corresponding to that particular MAGA will kick in. But it's not always the case that the penalty is monetary. It could be, depending on how the contract is structured, it could be an agreement to extend the contract further to cover or make up for the losses. So the idea really is to ensure that what has been planned, what has been put in the contract, there is certainty to it of it happening.
Attorney Agra, you were smiling the whole time. Is this reasonable? Is government's insistence on, minimum guarantees or whatever, incentives or risks allocation, is
Actually,
this
now
reasonable?
MAGA is a boilerplate provision compared to before. Number two, let me ask the audience, what's your number one fear from you on the private sector? What's your number one fear when you deal with government? And by the way, I'm in government now, so I will not be offended. Although there's no empirical data yet, we call it successor risk. When we say successor risk, imagine a 50-year contract. How many presidents will there be? 6? How many governors and mayors? 18. How many chairpersons of the Philippine Reclamation Authority? 50, because our term of office is 1 year. So MAGA protects against, among others, changes in interpretation, how you view your contract, done by the previous administration vis-a-vis the current administration. So MAGA is very important now. A lot of the template contracts, whether solicited or unsolicited, contain this provision.
So this is reasonable.
It must be there. We need to protect the contract, because by protecting the contract, we protect the project. And we also protect the other partner, which is the private sector.
Mr. Lim, considering that the banking sector is, well, interest rates are going down, reserve requirement ratios are going down, there's a lot of cash in the system. The question is, but on the one hand, that's good. On the other, there's a looming recession that everyone talks about. There's a trade war. Do you think the private sector is very hot about spending big money today?
Well, the private sector is always looking for opportunities which will generate reasonable returns, wherever these are. Infrastructure, manufacturing, services, etc., etc. So for as long as they see that there are reasonable opportunities in the infrastructure space where the risks are properly managed, they will deploy capital for this. No? From a banking perspective, you see, in infrastructure projects, what proponents usually do is they try to make the project vehicle bankruptcy remote and borrowings on a limited recourse basis. One reason for this is because, especially for the large ones, the conglomerates that have the capacity, technical know-how, and wherewithal to develop and execute these projects have borrowers limits, not just with local banks, but also with foreign financial institutions. So for projects of this nature, they would like the exposures of creditors for these projects to be limited to just that particular project vehicle and not eat into their borrowers' limits. That's where all these issues arise. Because of that, and because of the mix of debt and equity for this project, it's usually typically 70% debt, 30% equity. You see right away that the risk-reward equation for lenders and shareholders are asymmetrical. The sponsors or the equity holders put in 30%, they generate all the equity returns. Lenders put in the bulk of the financing, 70%, but the returns are only limited to their interest earnings. Nothing more, nothing less. Probably less if the borrower goes into default. Which is why banks are so particular about many of the touch points Undersecretary Pecson mentioned in his speech, and MAGA. See, in limited recourse project finance, it is a concept whereby all the risks attendant to the project are allocated to the parties involved in the project who are in the best position to bear these risks. And the parties to the project are also very clearly identified and part of the contractual process.
Okay, so we now go to our fast talk round. For our panelists, you're only allowed to answer with one word. One word, no explanations. Okay, fill in the blanks. So it's a quick one. With 2.5 years to go, I think the Duterte government will accomplish blank percent of its flagship projects. Give me a number, sir. 2.5 years to go. You think this government...
You mean at the start of administration?
For his administration, 2.5 years to go. What's the percentage of projects completion are you expecting? Just a number, no explanation.
It's quite low. I think maybe less than 60%.
Okay, Attorney Agra, just a number.
Pass. No, because complete means awarding of the contract, or you have the contract constructed.
Construction started.
I'll take the safe answer. I'll go with PPP Center here.
Copy from your
Yes,
seatmate.
yes.
Okay, next.
Well, if we get the approval for our 4 unsolicited projects, then for Aboitiz yun.
Okay, Mr. Lim,
Probably 50%.
50%. If there was one project the president should prioritize, it should be blank. Just one, just a name.
I'll go very basic. I really emphasize education.
Wow, education,
Transport.
transport,
Airports.
airports,
Transport.
transport. Our greatest ally in the build is blank. Name a person. A person.
An individual.
An individual. Our greatest ally in build
Well,
is.
I'm from government. I should say Duterte.
Okay,
I'm from government, so the president also.
okay.
Well, I suppose the appointment of Vince Dison as the presidential advisor for infrastructure projects.
Okay,
It's a good.
The president.
the president. I'd say Yusek Pecson, because he's here. Okay,
And the panelists.
and the panelists as well. Okay, you want to solve right-of-way issues, do this. Do what?
Well, I'd like to resolve this even before we award the contract, so that things are already clear
Before they even
before
start.
we take on, because it's another MAGA potential.
Okay, Attorney Agra.
Follow the law. We have a right-of-way law.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you want transport project, you have to amend the right-of-way law to make it, to make the subterranean rights of the government 20 meters rather than 50 right now.
Okay, Mr. Lim.
I think the biggest challenge is the right-of-way issues faced by all these PPP projects.
Okay. Final, an example of a project that fell through the cracks because of lack of continuity from one administration to the next is.
My God, you're asking me.
Well, there is in fact one project, but it's not from one new administration to the next. It was from one new DOH to the next DOH. And this is the orthopedic modernization project, which we all know it happened during the time of President Aquino. But the new DOH head had other ideas.
Okay, Attorney Agra.
Actually, the same project. Although these are two different secretaries, they both belong to the same administration.
Okay, ma'am.
A lot.
Okay, Mr. Lim.
But yes, a lot. But the one that immediately comes to mind is NAIA Terminal 3. Many issues surrounded that project, but the point is, after its completion, it sat unused for 10 years. And by the time it opened, it was obsolete.
And I'm going to add one more question, and this is coming from one of the earliest and most distinguished PPPs, of course, would be the water concessionaire, the privatization of water. How good is government at holding its end of the bargain? 1 to 10, 10 being very good.
From a scale of
1 to 10.
to 10. You know, when pressed with this question, I always say it depends, but you're asking for a number. So
For a number.
I'll put it in the middle, 5.
Okay, Mr. Agra.
Again, this is one of those success or risk issues. So as an academic, I'm saying 5.
5. Ma'am? Pass.
I'd say 5 also.
5. Safe answers. Okay, we have about 4 minutes left before we open the floor to questions. I wanted to ask about joint ventures. Because some say this is the smartest, fastest way to deal with government. For example, you joint venture with the city government, like the Pasay Harbor City, partnering with the Pasay City government for the reclamation of 265 hectares of municipality waters. That's fast. I mean, who's going to challenge this partnership where the city government is part of it? What do you think of joint ventures with local governments? Because Cavite is also searching for a partner for its $10 billion Sangli Airport. So what do you think, very quickly?
By the way, currently, under the government bureaucracy, joint ventures can be undertaken by local governments, by government corporations, by government instrumentalities, government financial institutions, and even state universities and colleges. Right now, national government agencies are not in the included list. But I'm of the position that they could. Regarding the, again, when we talk about projects, it's a long process. You have to select your partner, then award, then we have a lot of requirements before notice to proceed. Why, insofar as reclamation projects are concerned, the first step is with local governments. Then there are a lot of requirements before you get the notice to proceed. We've issued a couple, and that took the whole process. One took 7 years. Some will take 2 or 3 years. So the process is not that fast. The award could be fast, relatively, but the issuance of the notice to proceed may take longer because we have a handful of requirements.
Yes, ma'am.
If I may add, I think I'd like to quote the late Secretary Padaranga. He was the one who got me into government. He said, when you've cascaded the PPP program to the LGUs, that's when the program is successful. I think we have to identify other solutions that would fully enable the LGUs to go into PPPs with the private sector. And if everyone's really capable, all LGs would be capable of that, then the progress would be really go up.
If I may add something to that. So joint ventures is really, as mentioned by my colleagues, is a very important modality, especially for local government units. And in that respect, the PPP Center has been undertaking capacity building on joint ventures for local government units. And that's just the reality we're seeing with the limited resources that they have, whether it's financial and especially technical. They depend on the private partners to get these projects moving. But it's then a matter of how to get it done properly and how to get it done more quickly.
I don't think we have much time, so I think we're ready for our final question. This is the winning question, and I'm going to give you an option. Do you want question A or question B? Question A is a safe...
Miss Universe.
Question A is a safe question. Question B is a controversial question, but I'm sure you'll enjoy question B. O question B na lang. I'll choose for you. Yeah, okay. So for those of you who have been paying attention this afternoon, you've probably heard right-of-way issues 12, 15 times. Right-of-way issues. In fact, the other day, I was with some businessmen, and they were laughing, and they were saying, because of right-of-way issues, we can't start this project. Government has to keep paying us the penalties because it's part of the contract. In short, they haven't even done the work, and they're getting paid. That's the MAGA in action. So obviously, right-of-way issues is a big issue. The question is, in the end, is democracy bad for infrastructure? For fast, efficient infrastructure? I'll give you 30 seconds to think. Okay, again, the question is, in the end, is democracy bad for infrastructure? Because everybody cries right of way. Everybody cries, this is my issue, this is mine. I'll give you 30 seconds to think. In the meantime, I'll share with the audience, because in China, I know someone personally whose property was going to get hit by a major highway being built by the Chinese government. The Chinese government didn't ask them, is it okay? The Chinese government says, we're giving you 3 years to move, we're giving you this payment. No negotiation. China's also known for pollution, but whenever there are very important delegates coming over, you know what they call it? They have the blue sky policy. Suddenly, the skies clear up. Because why? The government orders the factories to stop production for a week before the delegates arrive. Okay, I think 30 seconds up. Let me repeat the question again for maximum effect. In the end, is democracy bad for infrastructure?
I cannot really say that democracy is bad for infrastructure. It's just that we need to put in place systems, we need to put in place the know-how, and also the determination to get things done according to the laws that we had passed. The problem is when things are being taken on as an afterthought, not as part of, planning for the project. So right of way should really, and what to do about it, if we know already in the beginning that there will be, say, 100 obstacles that we have to overcome, then let's plan for it rather than let's sign the contract and let's think about this later. Democracy has nothing to do with that.
Attorney Agra?
Democracy is never bad as a concept, but we must also recognize that there are no absolute rights.
Okay. Ma'am?
Yeah, no, democracy has nothing to do with it. We have the laws, it's really just the implementation.
Sir?
I think democracy has nothing to do with it. We just need to be able to put in place a mechanism to ensure that all the stakeholders involved in these particular issues come out with a win-win solution. There is a particular project, I will not name it, where the right-of-way issues did not involve private sector occupants. There were the occupants involved were largely government instrumentalities, believe it or not. But it took a very, very long time to resolve the relocation of those occupants.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause to your panelists this afternoon. Thank you, Yusek Pekson, Attorney Agra, Ma'am Cosette, and Mr. Lim. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much to our moderator and dear speakers for the panel on PPP for Build, Build, Build. May we please ask our panel to stay on stage for a quick photo opportunity. While the speakers are having their photos on stage, may we encourage everyone to actively participate in the discussions today, especially during the open forum. If you have any questions, please approach any of the microphones on the floor and wait to be recognized by our moderators. Our speakers and panelists would be glad to answer them. Should you have any other questions after the forum, please do send them over to forum@arangkadaphilippines.com. We also invite you to tweet about the event by using our event hashtag Arangkada Forum 2019. Please also like us on Facebook and also connect with us on LinkedIn.